Glad to see that a good number of you were not out partying too late last night and were able to be here this morning. So, good to have our campers back as well, those that went up to winter camp and had a good time, although a little bit of scariness Friday night from my understanding, but we'll talk about that probably more later. We're going to be continuing our study of the book of Revelation into the new year, of course. We're not going to just drop it and move on to something else because the calendar changed. So we're in Revelation chapter 7 this morning, Revelation chapter 7. And as we get started this morning, if you will, please join with me in a word of prayer. Our Lord and our Father, we are thankful and grateful for the opportunity to gather here with like-minded Christians and to study from your word. And we pray, Father, that our hearts and minds will be open to it. Help us, Father, to learn from its truths and to be strengthened by its message as we strive each day, Father, to be more like your Son. We ask, Lord, that you'll be with a number that are not with us for this morning for whatever reason, whether it be for travel or sickness or many other things, Father. We pray that you would be a comfort to them and keep them safe and bring them back to us. In Christ's name, amen. All right, so we were talking about the multitude, the 144,000, and then there was this great multitude, right, that began to worship as well. And then we see that John is presented with a little bit of a challenge in verse 13 of Revelation chapter 7. So the 144,000 are selected, and then this multitude that no one could count that was standing before the throne, and they are crying out and praising God. And if I could have a volunteer read verses 13 through 17 of chapter 7, please.
Then one of the elders answered, saying to me, "These who are clothed in white robes, who are they, and where have they come from?" I said to him, "My Lord, you know." And he said to me, "These are the ones who come out of the great tribulation, and they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. For this reason, they are before the throne of God, and they serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will spread his tabernacle over them. They will hunger no more, nor thirst any more, nor will the sun beat down on them, nor any heat. For the Lamb in the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and will guide them to springs of water of life. And God will wipe every tear from their eyes."
Thank you. All right, so I find it interesting here that this elder somewhat challenges John to be reflective or to be, cognizant of what's going on, right? He asks him, who are these people? You know, honestly, it's not that much different from Jesus's challenge during John's apostleship, right? When he said, well, who do you say that I am, right? So we need to realize that God expects us to be contemplative, and he expects us to be challenging ourselves as we read these things to try to understand. Now, thankfully, in this instance, we have divine commentary, right? God tells us who these people are. And this is a peek into the future, if you will, because where did these Christians come from? Where did these worshipers, according to verse 14? Out of the great tribulation. So this is that tribulation. This is that time of struggle, this time of war and death that the seals represented. And so this is speaking of a future event, but this is not speaking of tribulation in the way that so many want to interpret it. This isn't this necessarily singular event preceding the second coming or as part of the second coming, but rather this is again talking about these seals that are being broken and the war that is going to happen and the affliction that it's going to bring to Christians. And these are those that have stayed faithful, even in the face of death, right? Remember, we talked about that in the letters to the churches, where he challenges them, be faithful unto death. That's unto the point of your life being taken. And these are those that did that. And so they're given this blessing of being there with God, right? And I love this picture. They serve him night and day in his temple, and he spreads his tent over them. Remember, the term tabernacle just means tent. Okay? And so even though a lot of our biblical translators have chosen to use the term tabernacle here, the temple and the tabernacle can't be the same thing. Right? That would be mixing imagery, mixing metaphors, so to speak. Right? You can't serve in the temple and in the tabernacle. They can't both exist at the same time. Okay? So when it says spreading his tabernacle, it doesn't mean he's somehow extending this place of worship necessarily. It means that he's expanding his home, right? Even as Jesus said that he went to prepare a place. And so then he talks about what that place with God, what that home represents. And it's a home that is no longer plighted by all of the things that those first four seals brought, right? There's no hunger. There's no thirst. There's not the sun beating down on them. They're not homeless. They're not starving. But rather they're there and they're protected. And they're with God. This is one of the most important images in the book of Revelation, and it doesn't occur just here. It's a image that is repeated throughout the book. Okay? And what we need to understand is that this is the real message of heaven. A lot of times, I think people get overly obsessed with chapters 21 and 22 in this depiction of heaven and all of the jewels and the streets of gold and things. But the real blessing of heaven is right here. And this message, this is the one that's repeated. The streets of gold and and those things, those aren't repeated. But this message of God caring for us and us always being safe in his loving arms, that is repeated throughout this book of comfort and joy. So which is the real message? One that occurs once or one that occurs multiple times? The one that's multiple times. So what's the real blessing of heaven? That we are there at God's feet and he is caring for us. Now, I'm not trying to deny that heaven is not beautiful. I believe it'll be the most beautiful thing that our eyes will ever see and that we will ever experience. But if heaven was muted grays and beiges for all eternity, would it really matter? No. Because that's not the point of heaven, right? It's being in the presence of God. Now, I absolutely believe that God does not create things without beauty. I mean, look at this world, right? This is a similar argument. God didn't have to make this world beautiful. He didn't have to make people beautiful. He didn't have to make nature beautiful. Right? But he did. Again, I mean, even just when we think about the foods that we eat and things, right? Apples and things don't have to have these bright and vibrant colors, but they do. So I really do believe that God is an artist and he paints in this medium of beauty, but that's not the point. It's just an extension of God. Okay? It's beautiful because the one that made it is the most beautiful thing in all the world, but that's the real beauty of heaven, right? And again, this very personal care being provided by God, right? Speaking here of the Lamb wiping away the tears, later it'll be the Father doing similar things. And again, this message of being repeated is emphatic. It's there to help us to understand that, again, it's one of the things leveled against God so often. And I read some posts on social media and had some discussions with people just this week about this, is that too many people believe that God is impersonal. God is not impersonal. He himself is going to tend to his people. Right? He's not going to be on some throne from afar that even in heaven we will just have to look at. He himself will be among us. He himself will wipe away our tears. Now again, I don't think that's literal necessarily. I don't necessarily think God is going to be running around with Kleenexes, so to speak, right? But it speaks of the personal care that God is going to provide. How many of us have scars? Right? Okay. Now, that's healed, right? The injury's not there, but there's an imprint of the injury, right? The same thing happens to us as we are healed spiritually as well. God heals it. He takes away the sin, but there's an imprint left behind. As one brother put it, sin manages to steal our innocence because we can never go back to a time without the knowledge of that sin. It damages us. And even though God removes the spiritual damage, he removes the guilt, he removes the punishment through the sacrifice of Jesus, we are changed in the same way that we're changed by our physical scars, right? God's going to remove that damage. When it speaks of him wiping away our tears and things, that's what the way I see it is, that it's later on we're going to see the tree of life and its leaves and things used for the healing of the nations. That's what I see in these verses, is God is tending to that damage and returning us to the way that we were supposed to be. Pure. And at the same time, have you ever been so happy that you cried? Right? We shouldn't necessarily assume that these tears are tears of anguish or pain or sorrow, right? And yet God is also going to attend to our emotions. Which, by the way, that's also a little sub note here. We're going to still have emotion in heaven, right? Because we're still going to be us. All right, so we have this beautiful message of comfort, right? So these seals broken, we've got the four riders heading out to wreak havoc on the earth. The martyrs are slain. There is terror upon the earth, right? As God challenges these kings and all that they're doing, and then we have this message of hope, this message that the faithful will be saved from all of this, while the kings of the earth that are wanting to fight against God's ways are calling for mountains to fall on them. God's people are being tended to by God himself. And then we get to chapter 8 and the seventh seal. Can somebody read chapter 8 and verse 1, please?
When he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour.
I want to do something here. I'm going to set a timer on my phone. For 1 minute. And I want all of us to do our best to be absolutely silent. Ready? Go. All right. Now, you probably noticed that it wasn't actually even silent in here. Door was squeaking, the heat's on. There was still noise. And that was only a minute, and I know that that was a challenge, right? Now think about all of the things that we've seen so far in the book of Revelation. As John first saw the throne room, what was going on? There was thunderings. There were angelic beings shouting praises. The elders have been praising. There's been this multitude praising. There has been basically nothing but noise. And now there is silence. Not for a minute, but for half an hour. I don't know about you, but I get uncomfortable when it's too quiet. There's very little else in the world to me that is as terrifying as walking, especially in the dark or something, and all of a sudden you start to realize that nothing's making any noise. Right? Maybe I've just watched too many movies, but I start to think, is something stalking me that the birds don't want to know where want it to know where they're at? You know what I mean? Like, even the birds are like, nope. But silence. And I wanted to point this out because John has focused so much on the sounds of heaven, right? And again, there's just so much in the sensory that John is doing his best to tell us about. He's even mentioned things like smell and all of these other things. And now there's this change as this last seal is broken. Everything stops. Yeah. But there's this acknowledgement of this momentous moment, if you will. And everybody just freezes for half an hour. Now, if I could have another, or somebody read verses 2 through 5, please.
And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Another angel came and stood at this altar, holding a golden censer, and much incense was given to him, so that he might add it to the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar, which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints went up before God out of the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with the fire of the altar, and he threw it to the earth, and there followed peals of thunder and sounds and flashes of lightning and an earthquake.
And then the silence is broken in a big way, right? Now, this is our first mention of these 7 angels, right? We've had the 4 beasts, and we've had the 24 elders, and there have been mention of other angels, but now all of a sudden, 7 angels who stand before the throne. And again, this to me just amplifies how much John is seeing, but how do you put that on paper, right? He's seen these 7 angels because he knows who they are. He knows what they do. But this is now the first time that he's been able to mention it, right? And they're given these 7 trumpets in preparation. But before they even raise the trumpets to their lips, another angel comes and he takes this incense, right? And this incense has been mentioned before, those prayers going up before the throne. But now more incense is added to it and then fire off of the altar. And this is again significant because this incense is represented by the incense that was burned by the priests, and also they were to take from the coals of the altar for that, okay? Now, one of the most significant uses of this incense in the Old Testament was the Day of Atonement. The incense was always burning. It was placed before the veil between the Holy and the Holy of Holies, okay? But the incense was to especially be burning on the Day of Atonement so that when the high priest pulled back that veil, the smoke from the incense still veiled the mercy seat. The incense there represents, again, yes, worship, but also this connection and this blockade from God. Okay? And he's using this now. This incense is added, the smoke of the smoke of which is mingled with the prayers. The fire is added to it, and then it is thrown to the earth. Again, these are judgment. It's a day of judgment, right? The Day of Atonement. Yes, it was a day of forgiveness, but it was also a day of judgment, right? The judgment just passed from the people onto the goats. Right? There were the 2 goats. We often talk about the scapegoat, right? But there were 2 goats. One that was sacrificed and one that was let out into the wilderness. And both were important because they both represented a part of God's atonement. The shedding of the blood was necessary for the removal of sin, but then the other goat, the scapegoat that was let out into the wilderness, represented God separating the sin from the people. And so this censer is thrown to the earth, and there's thunder and lightning and the sound of an earthquake, right? And I'm going to assume that almost everybody, if not everybody in this room, has experienced an earthquake, given where we live, right? Are they quiet? No. Right? And I'm not even talking about like the stuff in your china cabinet rattling around, right? There's this low rumble that's associated with especially larger magnitude earthquakes, right? I would happen to be on a family vacation to Disneyland in the early 90s when there was a very large earthquake. It was the first time I'd ever experienced that. I'm originally from Oregon. We don't really have those, at least not the part of Oregon I'm from. They do have them, but not with the frequency or the magnitude that occurs in parts of California. And I can just remember that sound, right? We were in a hotel several floors up, but it just sounded like a train. That rumbling. And I remember it lasting for a lot longer than the movies ever really kind of, gave the impression. And I've experienced others since then, but again, there's sound associated with earthquakes. And again, this is something we don't always think of, but especially the part of the world that these letters are sent to, the Turkish peninsula, also experiences large numbers of earthquakes. Big ones. And so again, these people know. In fact, it's common in historical records for entire cities to be destroyed by earthquakes. I believe it was Smyrna, if I remember right, was one time destroyed by an earthquake. And so again, these people know all that entails, that it's not just, right, the uneasy feeling and stuff falling off of shelves. There's a whole lot more to these earthquakes, right? And then in verse 6, it says, the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. Now it's interesting here, right? We think, okay, this is all going on, right? But the 7 seals, but here we have 7 trumpets, and how are they sounded? Is anybody right ahead? Did they all sound them at the same time? No, they sound them in order. So the 7th seal has 7 progressions. See what John's doing here? Remember our circles? Overlap? Okay? And this almost becomes its own section here, but it's still part of this 7th seal being broken, right? And we see that, again, remember, a lot of this stuff is happening concurrently. Not exactly at the same time, but it's all really tied into each other. It's not as though the 7 seals, okay, that's over now. Now we're going to move on. It all kind of picks up inside of itself. And we need to see that. All right, so can I have a volunteer read? Let's just go ahead and read verses 7 through 9. We'll just do the first 2 for right now.
The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down upon the earth. And a third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood. How far do I go?
Verse 9, please.
A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed.
All right. So here we have these first 2 trumpets. The first one sounds, and there's hail and fire. No mention of brimstone here, though. All right. But again, this is another one of those images that we've seen God use in times of judgment, but not always associated with the judgment, right? Now let's talk a little bit about the number 1/3. So this is obviously an incomplete number, right? The number 3, though, what do we usually associate that with? The Godhead. Yeah, divineness, right? So this is divine judgment, but it's restrained. Because only a third is going to be damaged. I want you to think about that. If a third of all of the plant life was burned, do you think we'd have some pretty major ecological issues? Especially if it happened all at the same time? And all of the grass. That's an interesting addition, that all of the grass burned, but only a third of the trees. And only a third of the rest of the land. But that would be, to use a common phrase, that would be a biblical catastrophe, right? If a third of the earth just went up in flames. And yet, that's restrained. Also significant when Peter talks about the and when he talks about the end and he talks about the second coming, how much of the earth is going to be burned with fire? In 2 Peter? Yeah. All of it, including the elements themselves, right? So if God's only destroying a third here, is this the final judgment? No. That's easy math, right? But God is going to come in judgment. He is going to come. But there's a couple of different ways that God uses these types of figures. We've already seen one in the letters to the churches when he talked about them having tribulation for 10 days, right? He didn't necessarily literally mean that for 10 days it was going to be the worst week and a half of their life, right? But when God uses these numbers to talk about his judgment like this, he's meaning that, look, it's going to be horrible. It is going to be terrifying, and it is going to be, life-altering, but it's not going to be complete. It's not going to be everything, and it's going to have a limit. God placing limits upon his own wrath and destruction is the only thing that has allowed any of us to be here this morning, right? And so he's showing that. He's showing that, yes, he is coming in judgment, right? He is answering that call of the martyrs. And it's going to affect everyone. In the same way that, okay, so there's a lot of different ways that you can divide up the earth into thirds, right? You could say, okay, so a third of America and a third of Europe and a third of South America and a third of Africa. But what if you just say all of Asia is wiped off the map? Is that still going to affect the rest of the world? Absolutely. Right? Look at what one volcano did a few years ago. Right?
Well, anytime you have a whole thing and part of it is missing, it's going to affect everything.
Absolutely. But again, that effect is going to be limited. And that's that in itself is, for a Christian, should be encouraging. Right? What did the wicked kings, did they see any way out? Did they think that there was going to be an end to the fear that they saw? No, right? Because they wanted the mountains to fall on them. Just stop this all now, right? But the Christian is supposed to read this and say, okay, it's only a third. God. And those of us that come through this great tribulation, where are they? At the throne of God. They're protected. They're in his tent. They are being cared for. All right, so then we have the second trumpet. And it's similar, right? A great mountain burning with fire. What does that sound like? A volcano? A great big ball of fire falling to the earth. Meteorite, right? Sounds similar, right? And if we are to believe scientists, such an occurrence has happened once before. Yes and no. Can't deny that meteorites have struck the earth, right? But this thing, whether it's a meteorite or a volcano or something, it comes and again, it hits the sea. But it doesn't just boil the sea, right? That's what we'd expect, right? If large amounts of very hot stuff hit the ocean, it just usually boils it and steams. And I mean, it still can be terrifying, right? And it still kills fish and people. But this turns to blood. By the way, every time God speaks of turning water to blood, it's in judgment. What was one of the first miracles that Moses did? Turn water to blood, right? A judgment on Egypt. Turning water to blood is almost always a directed judgment as well, by the way. All right, so if the water to blood that Moses did was a judgment on Egypt, who would the Christians be being afflicted by that God would be issuing this judgment upon? The Christians of John's day. What nation? Rome. Remember, we're about to enter a time of history where the Jewish persecution stops being much of a thing because they're going to be almost as persecuted as Christians. In fact, Roman persecution against Christians began out of the Roman persecution of Jewish people. Does anybody remember in the book of Acts how it came to be that Paul met Priscilla and Aquila? They were Jewish Christians that had been living in Rome, but why did they have to leave Rome and go to Corinth? Because the Caesar said no Jewish people could live in Rome. He kicked them all out. And Christians were seen as because what religion did Jesus practice his whole life? Judaism. And so Christians were seen by the Romans as an outgrowth of Judaism at first. But then they began to see Christianity outpace Judaism. And Judaism was easy to strike down, right? They thought they did it in 70 AD, right? Because they destroyed the temple. But these Christian people didn't stop. The destruction of the temple didn't seem to make a difference to them. And that's when Rome begins to realize, oh, we've got something entirely different on our hands here. And the persecution of Christians began in earnest in roughly 120 to 150s, depending on depending on how your historian, how widespread they want to say that it got right away. But it was going to get bad for about 200 years. 150 to 200 years, it got bad. And it was almost all directed from Rome and Caesar. And there is this promise that as they are going to face these afflictions, as they are going to face these persecutions, as some of them are going to be martyred, God is going to come in judgment upon them. He's going to turn the water to blood. All right, let's look at verses 10 and 11. We've got a couple minutes left here. We can get another trumpet in. Now the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell upon a third of the rivers and on the springs of waters. The name of the star is called Wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the waters because they were made bitter. All right, our oceans are extremely important, right? And especially to people living in the Mediterranean world, a lot of their culture came from taking advantage of the fishing and the trade that was possible through and across the water, right? But do we live off of salt water? No. We live off of fresh water, right? And so God here sends this wormwood star. And this term wormwood, it's associated with, some herbal things and things. But when it talks about the waters being made bitter, this is also an allusion to some Old Testament things that happened. And the term bitter doesn't mean it was just, it wasn't just Lamore water, right? This was water that was poisonous. And men died because of it. Now, interestingly, a third of the rivers, lakes, and springs and things are made bitter, but he doesn't say a third of men died. He just says many men died. I don't know that there's any major theological thing, but I do think it's interesting when God breaks pattern. And no, I do not believe that there's any connection to the term wormwood and Satan. This is simply God applying a phrase to what he did to this water. And again, it's probably a common term used in their day of something that had this very distinctive taste and smell that the reader of John's day would immediately go, I know what he's talking about. Right?
The Bible talks about Jesus partaking of the bitter cup.
Mm-hmm.
It's referring to he's dying.
Mm-hmm.
So when we partake of the bitter water, there's going to be death.
Yeah, in the wilderness wanderings, there were times that Israel came upon bitter waters, and they had to be cleansed. They had to be made healthy to drink. And that's what he's talking about. And, there obviously, yes, the oceans and seas being turned to blood and the fish dying, that's going to have a major effect on things. But when you're fresh water that you need, right? We all need water every single day to stay alive. When that becomes tainted, now we really got to panic, right? And so there's this progression that we need to be aware of here, right? Because it's not, people are going to start, okay, we made it through the fire. Okay, we made it through the blood water. We can't drink our water now. Okay. Doesn't stop there, but we are going to stop there this morning. So, Lord willing, we will pick up there in verse 12 with the fourth trumpet next week. Thank you.